Schizophrenia, schizophrenic, schizo. These words evoke strong reactions: fear, curiosity, feeling offended. If you've taken a psychology class before, you've likely been told not to identify people with their so-called illnesses, or, as is increasingly said these days, their distinct expressions of neurodiversity. The assumption here is that one is always more than their diagnosis. Yet, what if saying you are more than your diagnosis here assumes that being schizophrenic means being something less? Or stated another way, what if being schizophrenic, in fact, entails being something more than who one is? Anti-Oedipus presents schizophrenia not as a problem located in the schizophrenic, but the society surrounding these individuals, while schizophrenia itself has a kind of revolutionary potential. To appreciate how this is so, it's first necessary to distinguish between schizophrenia as a process and as the result of a process, or the non-pathological breakthrough and the possibly pathological breakdown. Second, it is vital to remember that Deleuze and Guattari conceptualized schizophrenia as a reaction to capitalism and Oedipus. Schizophrenia is produced by capitalism both in the latter's activity of decoding flows and surplus production, as well as in its attempts to impose axioms that establish internal limits through appropriating old codes from other social machines to serve as a repressing force. It will be a task of schizoanalysis to promote a kind of schizophrenizing in contrast to the neuroticizing of an Oedipal psychoanalysis. As such, we will consider schizoanalysis and its intent to elicit this effect. Finally, we'll conclude this mini-series by considering how well Lacan fares in Anti-Oedipus and whether or not there can be any genuine reconciliation between his thought and the ideas presented here. As a process, schizophrenia entails how desiring production pushes past the limits of social production, especially capitalism's repressive internalized limit, by scrambling social codes while being a transmitter of decoded flows of desire. If the Oedipalized family is the model of such social codes within the capitalist machine, then schizophrenia escapes Oedipal codes, no longer willing to be tied to familial identifications, including parent-child affiliations, as well as those identities associated with sexual difference formulated through the binary of male-female. Rather than ask if I am dead or alive, or if I'm man or woman, as the neurotic does, the schizophrenic becomes someone who is trans-dead alive and transsexual, thereby expressing the conjunctive syntheses of the celibate machine. This is not a matter of two contraries being identified as the same, but an affirmation of their differences as differences. Now, what does that mean? I think here it's important to see how Deleuze and Guattari understand sexual difference. They claim that sexual difference only exists as a means by which power exerts itself. We concern ourselves with biological differences because it is in our social interest. To be transsexual, then, here is not to adopt another sexual position among others, but the decoding of sexual difference so as to affirm difference as such. In this sense, the schizophrenic process can be thought to be revolutionary. It's not that schizophrenia itself constitutes a revolution, but that it breaks loose the decoded flows of desire in such a manner that opens the possibility for revolution. As to what Deleuze and Guattari mean by revolution, it's a little difficult to get at because they are wary of those previous overt attempts to be revolutionary in a manner that simply installed a new regime of social production. And this is perhaps why their own view of revolution is tending to be scarce with detail. To be revolutionary indeed entails overthrowing fascist regimes that enforce the codes of social machines. It also entails allowing the unpredictable flows of desiring production to be unleashed in such a manner that opens the possibility for something new. Still, they appear to hold back on specifying what that will or should look like. Given that the schizophrenic process is framed as a good thing, a breakthrough. What do we then make of the fact that this process often results in a breakdown in the schizophrenic as one who is sick? In part, it seems the pathological dimension is a matter of how the schizophrenic process intersects with the social machine that seeks to constrain it, to dam up its decoded flows by seeking to reposition the schizophrenic in relation to Oedipus, that is, as one who is in need of being Oedipalized. The friction from free-flowing desiring production running up against the constraints of social production leads the schizophrenic to endure incredible suffering, vertigo, and sickness. The social machine partitions off these decoded flows of the schizophrenic process from intersecting with any other decoded flows that, if they did come together, could give rise to a new organized desiring machine. The absence of such organization then leads the schizophrenic to withdraw into the undifferentiated body without organs, whereby desiring production is arrested. As mentioned, the body without organs is a model of death, but the model of death here is catatonia. The schizophrenic moves from one who is closest to the beating heart of reality, an intense point identical with the production of the real, to a state of zero intensity. Important to keep in mind here is that the problem does not reside in the schizophrenic, but in the society that seeks to repress that individual. In this manner, the schizophrenic is likened to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who sought to overturn many of society's precepts and suffered greatly for it, along with also paralleling Zarathustra's call for a kind of Dionysian creativity in the schizophrenic process of giving rise to decoded flows leading to desiring production. Having considered how Deleuze and Guattari conceptualize schizophrenia, we can now move on to the constructive practice they propose, which they name schizoanalysis. To better understand what schizoanalysis is, it may be helpful first to consider what it is not. It does not engage in interpretation because, they state, there is nothing to interpret. There are only machines, desiring machines, and the resistance to those machines. As such, the schizoanalyst is not an interpreter or theater director, as is the psychoanalyst, but a mechanic. Connected to this is the foregoing of a search for unconscious material or any attempt to discover supposedly deeper meanings of psychic activity. The unconscious does not mean anything for them. It is not a symbol-producing machine. Instead, the schizoanalyst considers the functioning of these unconscious desiring machines, the syntheses they enter into and operate within, and the use one makes of these syntheses. In light of this, schizoanalysis does have several aims. First, it aims to destroy the pseudo-forms of the unconscious. This task entails exploding the concepts of Oedipus and castration, for example, demonstrating how they are artificial, repressive constructs. They are not the truth of psychic life applied to the social, but in fact are a social creation aimed at suppressing the revolutionary decoded flows of a desiring unconscious that is productive rather than lacking. Second, schizoanalysis aims at discovering desiring machines, learning what they are for a subject, how they work, what flows and breaks are at play, etc. It seeks to discover how these desiring machines get invested in the social field, and in turn what social machines do with this desiring production. It asks what place the socius reserves for desiring production, what generative role desire enjoys therein, and what kinds of reconciliation, or lack thereof, are brought about between the regime of desiring production and the regime of social production. Every libidinal investment is social and bears upon a socio-historical field. Schizoanalysis considers these investments in the social to be primary over familial investments. Schizoanalysis seeks to bring to light how these intersections take shape and express themselves across various contexts. A dimension of this includes discovering how desiring machines, in producing social machines, do so in such a way that they come to desire their own repression, which is something that Deleuze and Guattari understand to be related to the death instinct. Another aim of schizoanalysis is liberating the schizoid movement of decoded flows and deterritorializations. Yet despite this revolutionary potential of the schizophrenic process, schizoanalysis has strictly no political program to propose. If it did, Deleuze and Guattari add, it would be grotesque and disquieting at the same time. Instead, it simply aims at liberating the pre-personal singularities repressed by social machines, mobilizing the flows they would be capable of transmitting and receiving, and assembling the desiring machines, grouping these singularities together. It is by grouping these singularities that the schizophrenic is no longer made to be forced into the category of madness. Madness here is no longer madness once such flows receive support from other flows rather than be partitioned off and deprived of them, leading them to retreat into the body without organs. Finally, the kind of revolution schizoanalysis aims at is linked solely to the interest of the dominated and exploited masses, wherein social production does its greatest work of repression. Yet this aim is also perhaps a reason why schizoanalysis refuses to propose any positive political program. For if such a revolution did come to pass, how could we ever say in advance what it would look like, since the decoded flows that are being freed up through the schizophrenic process are meant to arrive from a place that is repressed? We do not know what a voice will say until it is allowed to speak. And we don't know what kinds of machines may emerge from the dominated and exploited masses once they are liberated from the yoke of social repression. To expect that in advance is to fail to recognize the present social situation. Anti-Oedipus marked a profound contribution to 20th century continental thought, and is claimed to have leveled a devastating critique against psychoanalysis, particularly those following Lacan's formulation. Given that so many of my videos are focused on the seminars of Jacques Lacan, I thought it worth the time to do a deep dive into this text. And this is because one of the central values that I hold for the life of thought is to seek out and explore the most representative and best expressed critiques of ideas that I'm holding or currently playing with. Regardless of where one lands concerning how legitimate Deleuze and Guattari's critiques are, one would be intellectually dishonest not to admit that Anti-Oedipus and other works by these authors are monumental in their contribution and influence. That being said, we can ask now, is this even a critique of Lacan's thought? While it is clear that Deleuze and Guattari are leveling a critique against most of psychoanalysis, especially Freud, but also followers of Lacan, and their Oedipalizing interpretations of his thought, they are much more cautious and even praising of Lacan himself, stating such things as, "And isn't this the strength of Lacan, to have saved psychoanalysis from the frenzied Oedipalization to which it was linking its fate?" And yet the way Deleuze and Guattari address the signifier, their rejection of identifying desire with lack, and their rejection of sexual difference in favor of a transsexuality, among several other points, do seem to be attacks directed at Lacan's thought itself, and not merely appropriations of his thought. So what are we to make of this apparent contradiction? Well, one possibility is that this reflects a distinctly French manner of critiquing one's contemporaries. In my own collaborations with some French philosophers and participating in conferences in Paris, I've seen this style of doing things firsthand, mainly when directed at an older and respected mentor. Much lip service can be paid to that respected philosopher, while at the same time delivering trenchant critiques of their thought, and then following that up by deflecting how much the object of criticism is actually representative of the critiqued philosopher's own thinking, combined with a series of praises for that thinking. This is just part of the politics and social graces expressed by many French intellectuals. And although you can find this in almost any cultural context, my experience is that in general, the French academic world takes this to a higher level of intensity. Another strong possibility is that Deleuze and Guattari legitimately see in Lacan's thought the very seeds and inspiration for their own thought, and that they seek to elevate those avenues Lacan opens for them and that others fail to see. Now, doubtless the truth of the matter lies in some mixture of the two possibilities. Part of the issue, I think, here concerns which Lacan we are speaking of. Although I do think there is more continuity between the early and late Lacan than what some scholars claim, there's also undoubtedly a shift in emphasis from symbolic to the real across these two periods. Anti-Oedipus was published in 1972, which means that Seminar 19 was being delivered at that time, well into the late phase of Lacan. Yet, it is possible that many in France were far more familiar with the earlier Lacan and less acquainted with the late Lacan. The Écrit, a more representative sample of this earlier Lacan, had only been published a few years earlier in 1966. So there is probably a tension here between the later Lacan and the more general reception of Lacan in France that was perhaps a bit more acquainted with this earlier phase. Regardless of which phase of Lacan we consider, another issue has to do perhaps with terminology. A pivotal question for me that comes up in reading Anti-Oedipus is whether the notion of lack is necessarily intertwined with Oedipus and the capitalist machine, and whether a concept of desire is fully intelligible without a notion of lack. What Deleuze and Guattari name desire sounds notably resonant with what Lacan calls the drive, which is located at the level of the real, as opposed to desire, which for Lacan is located at the level of the symbolic. For Lacan, the drive is born of an excessiveness of bodily intensity called jouissance. The infant's world is first one of jouissance and drive before becoming structured by a symbolic order that gives rise to lack and thus desire. And indeed, desire is conceptualized by Lacan as a kind of defense against the drive to go past one's limits in jouissance. So although the terminology is used differently, there may in fact be a more remarkable convergence on this point than it first appears. So where then is the real difference? Where Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari may more clearly differ is in how they conceptualize one's relationship to this lack and socialized desire. Although these thinkers do seem to converge on a formulation of desire as being born of repressive socialization, it's possible that Lacan does not necessarily see this as a completely bad thing. While particular positionings relative to symbolic authority can be more detrimental than others for Lacan, he does not always seem to be advocating the kind of revolutionary overthrow of the social order that Deleuze and Guattari appear to put forth through their schizoanalysis. In other words, it might be like saying that whereas Deleuze and Guattari are attempting to get rid of any master, Lacan is posing the question of which master will you serve, with the embedded assumption that serving a master is inevitable. However, in framing the differences between these thinkers in this manner, I also recognize that there are differences of opinion on how much Lacan's thought can be considered pro-revolution, which may be reflected in a divide found in the secondary literature concerning those who see Lacan promoting a kind of ethics of the real versus those who see him promoting an ethics of desire. Stated another way, some view Lacan as promoting a radical transgressive act that surpasses the limit of the signifier, leading to a kind of subjective destitution. This is the ethics of the real. Others view Lacan as promoting acts of sublimation, whereby the signifier is allowed to enter where it had thus far been prohibited, thereby freeing up the signifier from its rigid entrenchments with particular meanings. This is the ethics of desire. Undoubtedly, the differences here begin to sound a lot like the differences between social liberalism, with its push toward moderation and reform, the ethics of desire, versus something like the more radical left-wing politics that is related to the ethics of the real. For those interested in learning more about this, I recommend an exchange between Mark de Kessel and Mari Rudy, which can be found in an edited work I published several years ago. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this summary of Anti-Oedipus. As is always the case, there is no substitute for reading the text itself. Perhaps these 3 videos will be a helpful, though admittedly imperfect, guide to get going in that regard. There were a lot of topics left out and a good deal of nuance flattened out, but such is the nature of this format of presenting without doing something like a section-by-section review of the entire text as I usually do from my other videos. Despite these limitations, I did find this style of doing a video and organizing concepts very helpful for my own thinking, and it allowed me to organize the topic of videos in advance of producing them, which I think helped reduce some of the redundancy that can be in a more section-by-section analysis of a text. So I do plan on continuing this kind of style of video for some future projects. You can support this work in several ways, as I always mention at the end of my videos. That includes liking, sharing, and subscribing. And if you wish to, and if it's within your means, you can also support this work by using the Super Thank You tip option on YouTube, or go on Patreon like these individuals are who already graciously support me in this work. With that kind of support, I generally try to prioritize their comments and questions across all tiers of support, which I'll have to do more and more often as the audience grows and comments become increasingly more common. I also provide finalized transcripts and unedited materials at other tiers. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.